This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hey guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I made my weapons or props for my Nia cosplay. I believe they're called Chakrams. First things first is I patterned these all out, and these patterns are available on my store Envy and Etsy, by the way, and then I cut them out in foam. For the base of the props, I used 4mm EVA foam, 6mm EVA foam works as well, and then I glued the two halves together. I did this because the foam I was working with did have a textured side, and I didn't want that showing, and I didn't want to have to like sand that all down, so I just glued two halves together. If your foam isn't textured, then you could opt for a thicker foam. You can just glue two halves together to get like 8mm of thickness. However, if you could just buy 8mm thick of EVA foam, that works too. I just want to note real quick that the rest of the foam used on this build is going to be 2mm EVA foam. And I'm using contact cement to glue everything together. To figure out how to use your contact cement, there are usually instructions on the bottle that will tell you exactly how to use it. So here I am cutting out some of those 2mm EVA foam details. This is a weird like loopy looking detail that sits on top of either side of the props. Because this pattern was so thin and small, I used sewing pins to help keep it in place. So I messed up and I forgot to stick the handle in between the two layers of foam before I sandwiched those together, so I had to go back in, open up the foam, and then stick this wooden dowel in between the two layers to get that little handle piece into place. If you are using a thicker foam like 8mm EVA foam or something, you can just Dremel a hole that's big enough to fit the handle in place, or you could just stick it on the sides. However, if you fit it in the foam a little bit, it will be a lot more secure. Then here I'm going through and I just glued on those little 2mm EVA foam details and started cutting around the edge of the top of the blade at an angle to make it more like slanted and blade-like. And then I took my Dremel and sanded that down to make it more smooth and create a really nice bevel. I also sand around the lower half of the prop as well and kind of round out those corners a bit, or those edges a bit. I don't make those at like a really sharp angle because that part, when you look at a reference photo, that part's not like a blade. It's just a little bit more curved. Like it's not supposed to be like blocky or square looking. So I just curve that out a little bit, make it a little bit more round, and then keep the top half at like a point or a slant so that it looks like a blade. I also sand and smooth the inside and then use a very small Dremel head to create those little grooves or U-shaped indentations into the inside of the blade. Now I'm just gluing on some more details. These are pieces that sit at either side of the handle, and I made these from 2mm EVA foam. So there is a little bit of an open edge that is left on the outer edge there. That's totally okay, you want that to be there. To close it up, I applied contact cement to the edges of the little 2mm EVA foam detail piece, and then onto a scrap of 2mm EVA foam that is big enough to cover the area, and then I just pressed it into place and cut off the excess of like all around the edges and stuff to make it just this little rectangular piece that sits there, and then used my Dremel to sand and smooth down the edges. Now I'm working on some more details of her prop, again, all 2mm EVA foam. These are the little pieces that sit on top of the detail that we just glued into place, like they're a little curved piece. You'll get a better idea of this later, or if you're looking at a reference photo, you should know what I'm talking about, hopefully. But anyways, all I'm doing here is gluing on these X-shaped pieces using contact cement, and there's about, I think, 3 per each thing. Then I cut some very, very thin rectangular strips of 2mm EVA foam and glued those around the edges of these pieces. In total, there are 4 pieces that look like this, like what you're seeing with the X's and everything, and then 4 pieces that just have the rectangular strips around the edge and no X's in the middle. I don't have any real measurements for how wide I cut these rectangular strips. I just made them really thin. That's all I know. They're probably a few centimeters or so. Once that was all glued down, I took my Dremel and sanded down the edges and any seam lines to make sure everything was nice and smooth. This clip wasn't centered, like it's out of frame, but all I'm doing is taking a heat gun, heating up those pieces we just worked on, and then curving it around the prop to make sure that it's going to have that nice curved shape that I need it to have. And then I'm gluing those 2 layers on top of one another and onto the prop where you can see it placed here. I'm also taking just some rectangular strips of 2mm EVA foam and gluing those in place following a reference photo around the bottom half of the prop. These rectangles are probably about like 1/4 of an inch wide and maybe an inch long. I primed everything with about a layer or 2 of wood glue and then started applying Bondo's glazing and spot putty around the inside edges, and really just any edges that felt like it needed to be smoother. This is going to fill in any of those like seam lines or holes or bumpiness and make things just smooth out a bit. I'm just applying it with my fingers. However, it says that you're not supposed to do that, but I've never really had a problem. You could apply it with a popsicle stick though, like I'm doing in this clip. And that little smiley face earlier was just to cover an address from somebody who had sent me something. I didn't want that to be shown, so I covered that up. Just thought I mentioned that because I realized that could be like really random and confusing to just suddenly see on screen. Anyways, back to what I'm doing. I'm just, again, once using the glazing and spot putty and filling in all of the seam lines on the prop, not just in like the center area. I applied it to the edge of the blade and to the lower half of the prop as well because I wanted it to be really, really smooth. I'm doing this now because I had almost forgot, but I used Cosplay clay or EVA foam clay to sculpt some more details which were on the handle of the prop. She has these little, I don't really know what the shape is. She just has these little like pointy round things on the sides of her weapons. I really don't know how to explain the shape of these, but if you look at a reference photo, you'll see what I'm talking about, and you'll see the final shape here in a little bit as well. I'm just sculpting it based off of a reference photo and using some tools to help get the shape, as well as a little bit of water here and there to help mold the foam a little bit better and make it a bit more smooth. Once that was sculpted and I sanded down the Bondo's glazing and spot putty, I did a few more layers of wood glue. I think I have about 7 on here total, and began painting. I started by painting the blue areas of the blade blue, and I used acrylic paint to paint all of this. I don't have a video of how I made this next part that I'm going to talk about, so I'm just mentioning it now while we have time, while we're watching me paint. And that is, she has these little triangular diamonds that sit on either side on top of that kind of blocky 2mm EVA foam piece or part that's red currently. And to make that, I just casted a gem in resin and then glued a very thin strip of black EVA foam around the edges and hot glued that into place. Then I painted on the gold, sealed everything off with a clear coat of glossy spray paint, added in some shading with black oil paint, and finished it off once again with some clear coat of glossy spray paint. I didn't get the last few steps recorded, so that's why I'm just explaining it now. Oh, and I painted the handles black, just matched the paint job to the reference photos, basically. To finish up this prop, I casted some very small gems in resin, used blue food dye to color it, and then used hot glue to glue them into place. I glue in each of those little tiny diamond-shaped slots between the 2 gold layers. And that finishes up this build. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Stick around for future videos. Thanks for watching, and bye!